Welcome back. This is People Chronicles. This is Annarose, and today my guest is Dr. Patricia Anewalt. We're going to pick up a little bit, Patty, where we talked about how you got into this profession, but also, it has to be stressful on you as an individual. And I'm just wondering, how do you not burn out?
Well, for several years, my kids are older now and they're raised, but for many years when I was getting into the field of grief counseling, I had two jobs. I would have my day job and hear these sad, difficult stories of people and develop the programs that I put together. But then I had to go home and raise my kids, and it kind of taught me a healthy balance, the importance of healthy balance, because I just didn't have the option of bringing what was bothering me at home. I think depending on the situation, certain very tragic stories that I hear, yes, I have to be very intentional in separating that out and doing something with it. For me, oftentimes it's processing with somebody else, talking to a peer, kind of getting it out. And when I was, for example, after 9/11, I spent 2 weeks in Shanksville, and I worked at the morgue and went to the crash site to meet with the families, and we planned a memorial service, and I journaled. I was learning so much. We were doing 12-hour shifts, and it was just amazing to be a part of all that, and I needed to do something with all that. So every night I would journal. We also would go out with the other people I was with Red Cross, and I'd talk with them, and we'd kind of share and compare our stories to kind of take all that as emotion and do something with it. So that was very helpful to me. And it really informed me in terms of my practice, because really what grieving people have all these, grief are the responses you have to loss. So it's all those different responses, emotionally, cognitively, psychologically, spiritually. There's a range of reactions that we have when we grieve. Mourning, people tend to lump them together, but mourning is what you do with all those reactions. So some people don't go there, and it just piles on and piles on and piles on, and then suddenly comes out somewhere else. So for me, I learned about myself. I just need to really express it in some fashion, usually by talking or sometimes journaling.
Uh-huh. That's great. Actually, I think writing is very cathartic.
Yeah,
I mean,
you would think that.
Yeah,
That's right.
Of course I would think that, yes. Because I did write Lunch with Lucille during my mourning period for my mother. So yes, I find that very cathartic in the journaling. Do you think that, speaking about that, do you think that men and women, do you think that they grieve and mourn differently? Is there any difference in gender-wise?
Well, sometimes, but I hesitate to make that generalization, because the example I often get years ago is there was a man I met, John Bramblett, up in Vermont, and his 2-year-old son was run over by a garbage truck driver. It was such a tragic situation.
I remember that.
And he was a mechanical engineer, so you could presume, being male and mechanical engineer, that he would be the type of person that would need to kind of act out his emotions and stay busy and tone down his feelings. That's what we call the active griever, somebody that really tones down their feelings and instead needs to kind of do to keep busy. Whereas an affective griever is someone who needs to process, needs to talk about it. So many men tend to be they tone down their feelings and they don't want to talk about them. But somebody like John is a great example, because for weeks and months afterwards, he would corner anyone that would listen and want to talk about his son. And his wife was much more private, and she'd say, "This is our personal information. Why do you need to talk to even strangers about it?" So I love that example, because it really kind of blows out of the water male, female. I think instead there's a continuum. Some people need to do and keep busy to cope with their loss. Other people need to really cry and talk about it and process it in a variety of ways. And it's a matter of helping people figure out, and this is what we do in grief counseling, is really listen to people and hear what it is that's most helpful to them. And oftentimes they worry they're not handling it in the right way. And then as we listen, we say, well, it sounds like that's helpful to you. And we give them permission to continue to do that.
Can you do something wrong? I mean, when you do your grief counseling, and because I know that you take it, that you take this very, very seriously, and because I know you as a person. Is it possible to do or say something wrong when someone is grieving?
Yes. Grieving people will tell you in that people feel uncomfortable when somebody's grieving. So because if you were deeply grieving, even I as a grief counselor, because I know you as a friend, I'd feel like I need to fix it for you, or I'd feel uncomfortable. What if I don't say the right thing? So I might say something stupid just to kind of fill in the space. Really what it's about is listening. And so sometimes grieving people will talk about, others will say, I know how you feel. And nobody really knows how another person feels. Grief's a funny thing. In some ways, it's so personal and individual, and in other ways, it's universal and we can all relate to it. So I'd say possibly yes, if we put our foot in our mouth and say something like, I understand, or you need to keep busy, or whatever it is that we give advice for. It's better to just listen.
Uh-huh. So you have really great listening skills.
Well, and I was just about to say that's easier said than done. I mean,
Yeah.
my own daughter, I often give the example of she'll call and she'll be upset and she'll be venting and she's telling me all her problems, and I'm quick to jump in and say, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And she calls me on it and she says, Mom, I called to vent. I don't want you to fix it with me. So yes, although I am a counselor, I think we all can improve when it comes to listening.
Yeah.
And it's not as easy as it sounds.
Yeah. Listening is probably the most hardest thing to do.
God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason.
Yeah.
Or a professor of mine years ago said, you take what you want to say and cut it in half. There's just ways that we really need to stop and maybe ask a question or two open-ended to hear where people really are.
It's very exciting. It's very, very, very inspirational, I think, One other thing, when we talk about people dying and loss, when you come into a situation that just happens suddenly versus someone who is ill, and, like when I lost my mom was 92, she went through a process of dying. There was no, I knew that she was going to pass away. But then there is the times like when you were dealing with the Amish community after the shootings that was just so sudden and so tragic. What is the difference there?
The difference, in a sense, is that oftentimes when it's a sudden, tragic situation, it's hardly sunk in of what's happened. People have trouble even really kind of coming to terms with realizing it really happened. So people actually don't fully start to grieve and process those reactions yet because cognitively it's still sinking in. If you think about, I often give the example of 9/11, what people did all day, they watched television. And if they got in the car, they turned on the radio because the magnitude was so huge and it was so sudden that, we want to understand why. Sudden, car accidents and things like that. We're trying to figure out what happened and understand the why behind it. So the deep grief and emotions almost comes later. And the other piece about sudden is that people too quickly try to get help for whoever has had that sudden experience. And they're usually not ready for help because, again, cognitively, they're just trying to process and realize this really happened. So we're never fully ready, even when we sit by the bedside of our loved one for, days, weeks, or months. We know what's going to happen. But there's that phrase, you can no sooner stare at the sun than you can face your own death or the death of a loved one. We're never ready. So there's still that kind of traumatic, sudden, wow, this really happened. There's an element of suddenness even with expected death, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Do you ever cry for your patients? I guess you call them patients, or your
clients.
Clients.
Not with them.
Not with.
I might tear up. But actually, I there's a little technique that we have as counselors when we hear very sad situations where literally there's a pressure point in your hand. And so if people are deeply grieving and telling us their story, they're really struggling and they need us to be there for them and to hear it and be compassionate. But if I started to truly cry with them, human nature, that person would want to comfort me. And the emphasis turns onto me instead of them. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's times when I cry. There's times when I'm very taken emotionally, but I take care of that separate from my being present with somebody. It has to stay focused on them.
Okay, well, that's a wrap. And Patty, Dr. Patricia Anewalt, I should say, I truly appreciate you spending time with us today and talking to us about the Pathway Center for Grief and Loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you.